afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this finance event on country strategies and emergent investment opportunities for a green recovery, taking place on the sidelines of London Climate Action Week and building on the themes that emerged from the Petersberg Climate Dialogue's finance session a couple of months ago. My name is Barbara Bruckner, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's session. As we just get started, let me just note a few housekeeping items. As you can see, we have an excellent lineup of speakers, and while our agenda is again quite packed, we do encourage you to share your thoughts on this topic and questions for the speakers with us through the chat function. We have set aside quite some time later in the session today for Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to those during the discussion, also to integrate them into the key takeaways from today's event. Participants will be muted during the session. We encourage participants to edit your name, to include your organization in parentheses if you wish, by right-clicking on your name in the Zoom. This session is being live-streamed and recorded and is available at climatepolicyinitiative.org. We encourage you to share the event using hashtag LCAW2020 and tag the organizers and speakers in your posts, which are available on our website. And my colleague will share now a link in the chat function so you can easily share insights from this event. So let's begin. While some countries start to reopen and attempt to restart their economies, many remain mired deep in the COVID crisis. But governments globally continue to roll out cash for economic stimulus and enhancing social safety nets. During the Petersberg Climate Finance Dialogue session, the high-level representatives and practitioners from the public and private sector stressed that we must continue ambitious action on climate change as the world recovers from the pandemic, particularly as trillions are spent on economic stimulus, and emphasizing that good policy is a critical enabler. All countries already have their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs in place, which at the time were their best attempts to address climate change. But the question is whether policies and financing solutions for green recovery can be informed by these NDCs and in turn help countries to be more ambitious in their long-term strategies to address climate change. In other words, good policy leads the way. I would now like to welcome our esteemed speakers for this opening session to talk about the importance of strategic design in enhancing climate ambition and recovery packages, as well as ensuring regulatory environments enable green recovery that also leads to better NDCs. And so I'm very pleased to first invite Minister Kwasi Kwarteng, Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth from the UK, to open our session today. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. I'd like to thank the Climate Policy Initiative for organizing this event. It is a pleasure for me to be speaking alongside Germany's Minister of the Environment, Svenja Schulze, and the UN Under-Secretary General Inge Anderson. My colleague, the COP President-designate Alok Sharma, expresses his apologies, and with regret, I'm afraid to announce that unforeseen circumstances have resulted in him having to not being able to attend this event. The fact that I'm speaking to you from my own department here in London is a reminder of the unprecedented times that we're living in. 2020 has seen countries across the globe take extraordinary measures to shut down large swathes of their economies in order to combat the coronavirus pandemic. Here in the UK, we did this on the 23rd of March, while also launching a series of major policy initiatives to protect businesses, workers, and consumers through the public health emergency. Now, as we approach the next step in the phased reopening of our economy, and as we look to recover and rebuild, we are faced with a huge opportunity. According to the IMF, governments across the world have already provided about $10 trillion for the recovery, and we're only at the start of this process. On Tuesday this week, the UK Prime Minister unveiled an ambitious economic strategy to usher our nation into the next stage of recovery, a new deal to help build the UK economy back to health. As the Prime Minister said, this moment gives us a much greater chance to be radical and to do things differently, to build back better. Of course, this is not just an opportunity for the UK, but for every country. We all together have an opportunity to create a fairer, a greener, and a more resilient global economy. And those of you attending this event today will know that we can only achieve this in partnership with business and finance. In the last decade, globally, we saw the cost of wind power fall by 49% and that of solar power by 85%. Renewables are already cheaper than coal power in 2/3 of all the countries in the world. This progress has only been made possible through countries, companies, and financial institutions coming together in partnership. They've deployed investment, they've spurred innovation, they've scaled up technologies, and ultimately, working together, we have driven down costs. But with temperatures still forecast to rise by around 3 degrees by the end of the century, we know that we must go further and faster to tackle climate change. So as we look forward to COP26 next November, our aim is to increase our ambitions towards a climate resilient, zero carbon economy. We want all nations to submit more ambitious, nationally determined contributions, committing to further cuts in carbon emissions by 2030 and to reaching net zero as soon as possible. As the UK's Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, I've seen many excellent examples of countries working together to drive ambition. Minister Schulze will know of the Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Action Facility, or NAMA, which is a great example of UK and German cooperation and leadership in this area. Through the NAMA facility, we have invested nearly €500 million in clean energy, electric buses, and sustainable farming projects across Africa, Asia, and South America. I'm pleased to say that alongside our German partners and friends, we will soon expand this successful program to launch a special funding window for projects focused on raising NDC ambition in the aftermath of COVID-19. With this commitment, we will support countries to implement ambitious NDCs and take hold of this unique opportunity to rebuild sustainable and resilient economies. At this moment, let me pause to mention some of those countries that have already come forward with improved NDCs. They include the Marshall Islands, Chile, Norway, Rwanda, and yesterday's newest member to this esteemed group, Jamaica. Welcome to you all. Thank you for the leadership you have already shown. The UK will come forward with our own more ambitious NDC as soon as possible. And I look forward to our friends and comrades around the world showing just as much ambition when they submit their new NDCs and long-term strategies. Ahead of COP26, we have outlined 5 areas which need particular attention: clean energy, clean transport, nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience, and tying everything together in the form of finance. I mentioned finance last because it really is the key to unlocking all further progress. The OECD estimates that we will need nearly $7 trillion a year up to 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year at the UN, our Prime Minister announced a doubling of the UK's international climate finance commitment to £11.6 billion over the years 2021 to 2025. This in turn will mobilise further finance from public and private sources, helping us to meet and indeed move beyond the $100 billion goal. Many of the multilateral development banks represented here today are also looking to align their portfolios with the Paris goals. And I hope that we can all work together on this important journey. As the UK takes up the COP presidency, we're calling on our international development partners to show similar ambition in their future climate finance, looking ahead to the Finance in Common Summit, our French colleagues are hosting in November. Today, I can announce that the UK's own development finance institution, the CDC, has published an ambitious climate strategy. This strategy sets out a comprehensive approach to align all of the CDC's activities with the Paris Agreement, based on the core principles of reaching net zero by 2050 and enabling a just transition, and while strengthening adaptation and resilience. But of course, public finance alone will not reach the scale needed to drive the transition. To move from billions to trillions, we will need all finance, public and private, to align with the Paris Agreement. In February, my colleague, the COP President-designate, joined Mark Carney to launch the COP26 Private Finance Action Plan to help private finance support the global economy transition to net zero. The BlackRock report has stated that global sustainable funds have attracted more than £30 billion in the first 3 months of 2020. That is an increase of more than 40% year on year. This is just one example of the huge momentum that is gathering behind this transition. And in the lead up to COP26, we want to build on that momentum. We want all financial institutions to commit to net zero targets with clear transition plans detailing exactly how they mean to get there. And today, banks, insurers, pension funds, and investors with balance sheets of $139 trillion combined are demanding that the sector engages with the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures. We have seen over 4/5 of the top 1,100 global companies now disclosing climate-related financial risks in line with some of the TCFD recommendations. To take this further, I'm asking all financial institutions listening today to commit to reporting a full set of TCFD disclosures in their next reporting round, and to demand TCFD consistent disclosures from their borrowers and portfolio companies. This, I believe, will send a hugely powerful signal that the private sector is ready and willing to support the climate transition, including in developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we all have a huge part to play in our planet's future. So I really hope and trust we can use this event to drive the conversation forward and together endeavor to build a fairer, greener economy. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwarteng, for sharing the UK's very ambitious plans towards a climate resilient zero carbon economy as we move towards COP26 next November. I think including just, let me stress a few items here through the UK's own development finance institution, CDC, but also the COP26 Private Finance Action Plan to help private finance support the global economy transition to net zero. And I really appreciate also your call for action here to the financial sector, and also for alluding to a clear, exciting initiative together with Germany. And it's therefore my pleasure to now give the floor to Minister Svenja Schulze, Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety from Germany. Minister Schulze, thank you so much for being with us, particularly in light of the fact that Germany just took over the EU Council presidency. So really appreciate that. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara Buchner, Kwasi Kwarteng, Inga Anderson, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really pleased to be here with you, and I'm really pleased that we are still able to hold these talks despite the continuing difficulties posed by the pandemic, even if it's only by video. The situation remains grave, and the economic and the financial impacts of the coronavirus pandemic are severe. So at the same time, the strategies and countermeasures to lead us out of the crisis are beginning to take shape. More than 100 countries have applied to the IMF for emergency assistance. And in the OECD and the G20 states, we are seeing the adoption of remarkable large rescue packages. This is the case also in Germany. This time it's especially important to maintain momentum on climate action. Above all, with regards to the financing the measures of implementation, our NDC, because the way out of the crisis, that is a unique opportunity. The 10 to 20 trillion US dollars which countries and international communities will spend in the next 18 months, they can put us on track for sustainable growth and for climate neutrality. And now, especially prevention and future-oriented action are worth pursuing. The recovery measures should also take us forward on climate action. And the 30 ministers that I hosted at the Petersberg Climate Dialogue in spring or earlier this year, they stressed that very, very well. And 3 weeks ago, Germany adopted the cornerstone of its rescue and future support program. And I am proud that it centers around investment and digitalization and then in climate action, green hydrogen, sustainable mobility, building modernization, stronger municipalities, make up a considerable part of the total packages. And the German government is currently working on a sustainable finance strategy. The government has also decided to issue a green federal bond in autumn, and I am especially pleased that this week key German financial actors agreed on a voluntary climate commitment. And this shows that the German financial sector is moving in the right direction, is also taking an active role in the transformation. And as Kwasi has already said, finance makes all the difference. That is why Germany's recovery package includes additional funds for countries of the global south. They should be helped out of the crisis quickly with a minimum of bureaucracy. And Germany stands by its pledge to double its budget allocated climate finance to 4 billion euros by 2020. We will achieve this goal through this year's supplementary budgets, and we will make a fair contribution to international climate finance after 2020 as well. Chancellor Angela Merkel confirmed this at this year's Petersberg Climate Dialogue. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this context, I am really delighted to be able to join Kwasi in announcing our new ambition facility under the NAMA facility. We are launching a special call for project ideas which is on a far larger scale than any call before. And it has a very specific objective. Countries which submit an ambitious NDC with a clear reduction path will be supported in its implementation. The aim is to enable them to unite economic recovery and climate action. And this initiative is a continuation of our excellent cooperation with our UK partners, and I would be delighted if more donors joined us. So please join us. We need more money for that. And yesterday, you mentioned it, Germany took over the EU Council presidency. It is a great responsibility. And one of my most important goals is to reach an agreement on raising the EU's NDC. And I expressly welcome the Commission's proposal to raise the 2030 target to -50 to -55%. And I'm also pressing for an agreement on the EU climate law, which legally enshrines the goal of climate neutral lifestyle and economy by 2050. The German Council presidency also want to swiftly conclude negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, on the recovery plan, and to structure additional funding in an environmentally sound and socially equitable way. And even if the COP26 has to be postponed until next year, 2020 is nevertheless a crucial year for climate action and above all for climate finance. Today's event shows that we are continuing to work shoulders on shoulders in that. So I'm very too happy to join this event, and all the best. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Thank you so much for sharing all these ambitious measures and plans during the coming months. 2020 is a crucial year, Minister Schulze. But I want to thank you and Minister Quarteng in particular for sharing this new exciting announcement of this major new initiative from your two countries, which through the NEMA facility will focus on supporting countries with particularly ambitious NDCs in the implementation of these targets in the wake of COVID-19. And I think thanks you also for your call to action for other donors. I think, again, very much needed. But again, I think this all shows the real leadership of Germany and the UK, and leadership that is much needed in these times. As I want to really thank you and Minister Quarteng for being here with us today and for all your action in this area. But with that, I'm very pleased to now turn to Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, Inde Andersen. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start to thank Minister Kwasi Kwarteng as well as Minister Sonja Schulze for their introductory remarks and for the great ambition that the UK is setting in its presidency, as well as the ambition that we have heard from Germany. That's exactly the level of ambition that we from the United Nations are calling for, and indeed the ambition that the Secretary General has called for tirelessly. I think the first point that I want to stress is that COVID-19 has shown us how very fragile we, this little blue planet, remain to things that we do not yet fully understand. Whilst we have known that there could be some sort of a pandemic, what this has brought to us, most people could not even begin to imagine. And yet we all understand that clearly climate change would be amplified, would amplify in a much greater way the kind of disruption that COVID-19 has driven to us. So that's maybe a wake-up call. My second point here deals with this wave of stimulus packages. And I think it's fair to say that the first wave that we saw was entirely fiscal in nature and did not have the green elements that we were seeking. But we need to understand that and not necessarily critique it. It was about getting money into people's pockets. It was about reducing VAT. They had a number of fiscal measures that were reasonable at that time in March and April. But what is really interesting and important is what we're beginning to see now. Because the first wave, as the paper by Stiglitz and others showed, had but 0.2% of green elements within it. But I think we need to understand why that was. And so it's very exciting to hear now about these additional packages that are coming out and the degree of ambition that these packages rightly hold. Because this time when countries are putting this extraordinary amount of public money, taxpayers' money, into the economy, offers taxpayers an opportunity to direct it to that future that we want. And this is where responsible governments, such as the kind of speeches that we've just heard, but from all countries, are seeking to try to make those shifts. And that's where the NDCs come in, and where we can see that these two paths, this massive recovery, be it that is done on public funds, can come along and really coincide with the NDCs and offer that blueprint in the NDCs for building back better, building back cleaner, building back greener. And I'm very pleased to hear from Minister Kwarteng about Marshall Islands, Norway, Chile, and Jamaica already having submitted their greater stretch. Bravo to them, and thank you, Minister, for highlighting that, because the governments now have this unique opportunity, as you rightly say. Secretary General Guterres has made it very, very clear that a return to business as usual is simply not on. He has called for 6 climate-related actions that can shape the better recovery, including, obviously, ending fossil fuel subsidies, making polluters pay for their pollution, tying public bailouts to green jobs and green opportunities, green infrastructure, green investments, and driving a shift in the green economy. And I really want to salute the mention of disclosure, Minister Kwarteng, because that is something that UNEP and UNEP Financial Initiative has worked quite a lot on with a number of institutional as well as private banks. And the NDCs are really that perfect vehicle for that. We need to understand, however, I think, and that's very much what we hear from both the previous speakers' inputs, is that unless this contains green jobs, it's not going to fly, because we need to ensure, obviously, that we can kickstart the economy and get people back to work. And here, as Minister has rightly said, actually the green energy, the green retrofitting on buildings creates many, many more jobs than the brown, if I may say so. And there's endless studies from the IEA and from papers across the world that shows that. But there is an added thing that I should say, maybe because the UK in COP26, for the first time, I would say, has made it so very clear that nature and nature-based solutions on the one hand have to be part and parcel of the brown side of the flipping the switch to cleaner energy, and understanding that investing in nature and nature's resilience can be critical. And here, part of that stimulus, we should also consider what some countries have done. Let me mention Pakistan. They introduced a $47 million program to hire newly unemployed people to do what? To boost the country's 10 billion tree tsunami, to plant more trees. This is good for biodiversity, it's good for local agriculture, and it's certainly good for climate change. And as we see these two conventions, biodiversity and climate change, pushed in the same direction, there's some real opportunities here. And we very much salute the fact that the UK is putting nature-based solutions on the agenda. And finally, on carbon pricing, we are seeing rock bottom hydrocarbon prices in the market now. So never before has there been an opportunity for countries to actually step in and make carbon pricing real. And we've seen a number of august papers and commentators precisely highlight that now is a time when carbon pricing can be put into place, frankly not felt too much, bring money into the economy, whether it be for COVID related issues or whether it be for green finance and greening of the economy. So let's think about carbon pricing and carbon taxes. For many countries, the $75 per ton carbon tax would increase the pump prices by less than the recent collapse in the global oil prices. Now, we would like to have it a little higher, but here, let's begin somewhere such that that differential can also help come into emptying government coffers in view of the stimulus packages that we have all had to pull out. And very finally, if I may, the G20 countries account for more than 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And they also account for, and are the proud holders of, 85% of global GDP. That puts upon the G20 a unique responsibility. And so the EU, the UK, China, amongst others, can really show a model what needs to be done. Because if those 20 countries do lean in and do step up, frankly, we will make that massive difference that is needed. And so very, very positive news to see in the UK, this large infrastructure package that we hope will have significant green element to make that switch. Very positive to see the European Union stimulus plan on green and the Green Deal. Let us make sure that these elements make it all the way to make those shifts, because building back better is what the UN is calling for, is what leading countries is calling for, and what is indeed the UK in its COP26 can make as a core element of a successful COP with ambitious NDCs. So with that then, let me once more congratulate the UK for the leadership that you will be showing as you take on the presidency. Thank Minister Kwasi Kwarteng, and also thank Minister Svenja Schulze, and indeed, of course, the Climate Policy Initiative for hosting this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Under Secretary General Anderson, for, I think, reiterating, first of all, also the UNSG message that the return to business as usual simply is not on, but also for sharing some of the good practices that are emerging and some of the opportunities that the current situation through the low oil prices bring. But also, I think, for reassuring all of us that UNEP will continue to support member states and partners to build back better, capturing opportunities for leapfrogging to green investment. And I also want to acknowledge, and you briefly referred to that, the important work that UNEP FI is doing in partnership with banks and insurers and asset managers, aiming to mainstream climate change consideration into the entire finance ecosystem, which is extremely important. So many thanks to all of you for a very powerful start into this event, sharing not only options and good practice examples of national stimulus packages and of public finance interventions that could help with funding a green recovery and underwriting enhanced ambition, but also announcing the launch of concrete actions and sustainable measures for economic recovery, like the NAMA facility and special window that we've heard about. So that's certainly bringing a meaning to the saying that a little planning can go a long way. So let me thank very much all the opening speakers for being with us here today and for getting us off a fantastic start. And I think with that, I'm going to turn over to our next session, unless any of our opening speakers would like to add any specific additional comment here.
No, thank you all very much for the real passion that's been shown. And I think, we're getting off to a great start. And what I'm particularly interested in and heartened by is the level of international cooperation. And we see the problem very much with the same focus. And it's really exciting ahead of COP26 to be involved with so many of you on a multilateral international basis. It's really great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Minister.
Thank you.
I would like to say thanks, and just one more call for, we need more donors. Don't forget it.
Couldn't agree more, and we certainly will do what we can through our work here and through the discussion that will follow to show also the opportunities to donors, but also really the need for additional leadership to join this international cooperation that also Minister Kwarteng has just outlined. So thanks so much, Minister Schulze. And so with that, let me now turn to our next session and just get us a little bit started by really kind of setting the scene here. I think what we see is that initial estimates indicate that between 10 and 20 trillion US dollars will likely be invested during the next 6 to 18 months to stimulate economies in the wake of the COVID crisis. And one of the key takeaways from the Petersberg Climate Dialogue's final session was that cooperation, which I've heard also from the opening speakers, particularly between the public and private sectors, would be critical for maximizing the positive impact of the recovery on mitigating the climate crisis and building resilience. So this session now will explore some specific initiatives that can help pave the way for balanced economic recovery, as well as enhanced ambition to address climate change and its impacts by capitalizing also new sources of finance. And we first will hear perspectives from public policy practitioners from 2 countries that have in many instances in recent years rolled out successful policies to stimulate green growth. First from Costa Rica on how an enhanced NDC can be an outcome of a well-designed recovery, and then a research perspective of how a large emerging economy like China could foster collaboration with others to finance the green recovery and deliver on an ambitious NDC. So with that, it's my real pleasure to welcome Minister Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who is the Costa Rican Environment and Energy Minister and the incoming CEO for the Global Environment Facility. Congratulations for that. And just to say that the minister's commitment to these topics is underlined by the fact that it's 4 a.m. in the morning in Costa Rica. So thank you so much, Minister, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to my colleague ministers and to Inger Anderson. My thanks, and I want to build from what they said based on my very personal perspective and responsibility as the Minister of Costa Rica. First, I want to say the following. When we talk about green jobs, we normally have this kind of image of somebody in the north putting a solar panel. For me, green jobs means a tourist guide in the rainforest of Cambodia, or in Belize, or in Kenya, or in Costa Rica. Green jobs must be in the center of these stimulus recovery plans. And this is one of the most important elements that we need to discuss. I'm the co-chair of the NDC partnership, where we have around 80 countries doing the review and update of the NDCs. Support from Germany, the support from the UK, and many European countries has been key into providing financial and technical assistance to up to 80 different countries on the review process of their NDCs. And let me tell you, I've been going through very close with many countries on that process. When I do the overall assessment of where we are within the NDC partnership, I come to realize that even though the process is great and the review is going perfectly, 70 countries within their coalition, total amount emissions is less than 10% of our global emissions. And here I want to highlight and remark what Ms. Inger Anderson just mentioned about what we should be expecting from the G20 economies. Developing countries, middle income countries are really doing their homework, they're doing their review process, but that won't be enough. That's one point. My second point is we can be able throughout this year to have a set of very ambitious NDCs, but the next question is, where's the money? Where's the money for the 1.5? And I want to talk a little bit about where is the money, because the money is where we don't tend to see it. Let me give you the broad numbers. We should be investing as of today, 2020, around $1.3 trillion to be on track for the 1.5. Actually, we're investing around $546 billion, which is just 40% of what we should be mobilizing in climate change. Around 60 to 70% of those $546 billion are mobilizing to industrialized countries, particularly on the transition of the energy and transportation sector. So we need to generate a balance within the North and the South. We need to generate a balance within the mitigation and adaptation. We need to generate a balance within energy and nature-based solutions. And we need to understand that we need to mobilize resources from all sources. If we see what is happening on the biodiversity side, and $1.3 trillion is just 1.6 of the global GDP, in order to have that perspective. On the biodiversity side, we should be mobilizing as of today around $150 billion. We actually mobilize $82 billion. So this is kind of the larger framework, because the financial approach for climate should fully include the 3 Rio conventions, being able to be on track to protect 30% of the planet, which is what I hope that will come out of COP15, and being able to fully mobilize full financial resources for climate action will require around 1.6 of global GDP. So where's the money? Well, the money is in a mix of efforts. And let me share my very own personal experience in Costa Rica. And I think that can be an interesting baseline for the political discussion on how we mobilize resources from all sources. Costa Rica has been a historical recipient of ODA and bilateral multilateral cooperation. That cooperation was key to mobilize and catalyze political and national processes by which we were able to understand 2 things which are key in this financial discussion. One, it is in the self-interest of countries to implement climate action, and based on that, it is the highest interest for countries to do the national domestic homework on how they can mobilize resources. Costa Rica was able to invest domestic resources through traditional and non-traditional resources in the last 25 years of around $10 billion. So today we are 100% renewable energy in the electric sector. And on the forest sector, we were able to mobilize domestic resources, $500 million in the last 20 years. So we don't have deforestation, land use change. So Costa Rica has no emissions, net emissions coming from the electric sector and the forest land use sector, which, by the way, are the 2 highest sectors in generating climate emission, because we were able to understand, first, it is on our own self-interest to go renewable and to go zero net deforestation. And we found that there were mechanisms by which we can mobilize domestic resources that were, and those processes were supported by bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And I want to stop here just to elaborate a little bit more on what Inger Anderson just mentioned. On the forest sector, Costa Rica was able to put a tax on carbon in 1997. And this is a different carbon tax. Yeah, I call it the tropical carbon tax, because it's very different to the northern concept of a carbon tax. The northern concept of a carbon tax is the one that you put a tax on carbon. People becomes more efficient on how they use the fuel. And by the way, you can finance technology transfer, so you can move away from the use of fossil fuels. Our Costa Rican version of the tropical carbon tax deals with a market failure. What is the market failure? You own a forest, you provide carbon fixation, and there is not a price for carbon. There's not a payment for that carbon. So we put a tax on fossil fuels that goes to a forest fund. That forest fund pays owners of forests for the carbon offsetting services. When you pay a owner of a forest, you can imagine an indigenous community, a small farmer, or a large farmer. We don't make such a difference. When you pay the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching or other activities we don't want to be done in the landscape because of the biodiversity of or climate implications, they will decide based on leveling the economic playing field to keep the forest. So we were able, based on our tropical carbon tax, to establish a positive incentive to those private owners of forests. This is the rationale that we put behind REDD+ 15 years ago, and it hasn't worked yet. There is not an international carbon market. There is not an agreement on Article 6, and the price of forest carbon is extremely low, $5 to $7 a ton. In Costa Rica, it costs $17 to generate a ton of carbon from our forests, and the international voluntary market pay us $5. So we got an issue there. If we don't fix those issues, the finance mobilization discussions will be the traditional one and the one I don't want to see, which is the South putting pressure to the North to double and triple the flow of resources from the North to the South, when most of the resources can be generated domestically based on the understanding that is in their own self-interest of each country to do your best effort. And I would like to finalize by saying that when we talk about climate finance and biodiversity finance, the numbers are huge, huge, huge. But those numbers can be cut off to half if we do the other pending homework, which is what the ministers mentioned and Inger also mentioned, which is phasing out all of the perverse incentives. Today we invest 142 times more financial resources in activities that generate tropical deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. Today, we invest $500 billion in activities that generates biodiversity loss, as opposed to the $82 billion that we annually invest in nature conservation, and the same numbers for climate change. I mean, the value, the cost of subsidies and incentives for the oil and gas and other activities surpass what we annually invest in climate mitigation and in climate adaptation. So we need to do those changes. And I think that as we phase out, and this is the greatest opportunity that we had in many, many years to do the transition, not just phasing out subsidies, but moving the capital market, that moving the banks, shifting them towards a green DNA operational. And I think if we are able to balance those things up, so this is the scenario. Developed countries continue on their commitment to provide strategic catalyzer ODA investment. That ODA investment must generate a domestic national process where countries understand how they can be more efficient in what they invest in climate and biodiversity, develop innovative mechanisms, and begin the phase out of those negative perverse incentives. And here we will have a good chance to be on track very soon for the 1.5 and hopefully for the 30% nature conservation of the land and the oceans. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Minister Rodriguez. That's great insights. I think very much appreciate also the links between biodiversity and climate. I think you shared some important lessons, both from the NDC partnership, but also from Costa Rica. I think most importantly, just to repeat, I think we need to stress that it is in the self-interest of countries to implement climate action, and that countries need to do their national homework to mobilize domestic resources as well. I think thanks for giving us a lot of homework already. I think most importantly to change the narrative and to use public finance effectively in order to really make sure that we unlock other pools of capital. And I think couldn't agree more with you to really think about how can you phase out the perverse incentives. It's not enough anymore to increase the climate finance. We need to make sure that we phase out the dirty flows of investment. So thank you so much for this initial opening remarks. And with that, now let me turn to Dr. Ma Jun, who is the director of the Center for Finance and Development at Tsinghua University and chairman of the China Green Finance Committee. Ma Jun brings a wealth of expertise related to the role of sustainable finance in the green recovery. And we are very pleased to have you here with us today. So Ma Jun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Can you hear me okay? Good. First of all, let me thank CPI for inviting me to join this very important discussion. Now, let me start by attempt to answer the question posed by Minister Schwartz just maybe 20 minutes ago. She was asking, where is the money for green investment? I would say the answer is partly hidden in the minister's speech. Because two ministers were saying that the fiscal authorities are now putting up like 10 to 20 trillion US dollar in the fiscal package in the coming few years. So we can get a small fraction of that for green investment, let's say 10% out of the 20 trillion, which is 2 trillion. that's going to have a huge leveraging impact on the financial sector, because if we can do the financial sector well, making them a green financial sector, then $1 of public money can potentially leverage $10 of private sector money. So the 2 trillion green fiscal money can be converted into 20 trillion sort of a total investment into the green and low carbon space. So really the question is, can we make sure that the fiscal authority are green enough? And secondly, can we make sure our financial system are green enough? So moving on to the question of how to green the financial system, my few remarks are on the 4 major areas of what I call the critical pillars for the green finance system. One is taxonomy. The taxonomy, I think, cannot be done really from a bottom-up approach, because it's taking too long. It would take a very, very long time for the private sector to negotiate and agree on a set of rules. So really, our experience is that this has to be driven by regulators. It can be done in a much more efficient way. And in China, we have already 3 sets of taxonomies, one for green banking, one for green bond, and one for green projects. And many other markets are developing their taxonomies. I'm very glad that Europe has just passed the sustainable finance taxonomy very recently. And we're actually now looking into possible harmonization of the Chinese and European taxonomy in order to facilitate cross-border investment, cross-border green investments between China and Europe. But in many other places where they don't have a taxonomy, I think they should develop one or adopt one of the existing taxonomies in order to enable the financial system to produce green financial products and drive financial flows to the right green sectors. The second thing to do is to build a disclosure system. The disclosure requirements were over time gradually moved from voluntary to semi-voluntary towards mandatory. And our experience in China is that we're halfway towards the goal of compulsory. Back a few years ago, we moved into a semi-compulsory scheme for listed company for disclosed environmental information. And by end of this year, our regulators will put out regulation to require all listed companies and all bond issuers to disclose environmental and climate information on a compulsory basis. That will allow the market participants, especially the investors, to really assess which projects are green, which projects are brown, and then channel the right green money into the right green projects. Now, disclosure is not just on green or brown, but also on financial risks that may potentially arise from financial institutions and corporates' exposure to environmental and climate risks. In that particular area, the NGFS is doing a lot of work. The NGFS refers to the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System. And I have an honor to chair the supervision work stream of the NGFS. And this year, we're going to put out 2 publications that's related to environmental risk analysis, which will provide case studies of the models and methodologies to allow financial firms such as banks, asset managers, insurance companies to quantify the future credit and market risks arising from their environmental and climate risks. For example, if you want to assess in 10 years' time, your loans to a coal-fired power generation company will become bad or not, you can use that model. And a recent study by our Tsinghua Green Finance Center shows that a loan to the coal-fired power generation sector could end up with a 20% NPL ratio in 10 years' time, largely because of technology change in the renewable space and the shifting demand for energy, as well as the carbon pricing schemes. The third aspect of a green financial system is incentives. So far, our pricing system is not fully working to internalize externality, and that's why we need some incentives at this particular moment to drive more flows to the green and low carbon sector, even if they're not very profitable at this particular moment, which means that the fiscal authorities, the central banks, financial regulators have to find various ways to enhance the returns of the green projects. And in China, what we did at the central bank level was to produce a re-lending facility targeting green. Namely, the central bank offers cheap money to commercial banks and through them to lend to the green projects at a lower cost and market. And many other potential incentives are possible. For example, subsidizing the interest payments for green loans, and allowing green bonds or other green assets as a collateral for banks to borrow from the central bank, and also changing risk weights for green and brown assets, namely by raising risk weights for brown and lowering risk weights for green, which will help lower the funding cost for green lending. And the final pillar is what I call capacity building within the financial sector. The financial sector, for example, banks will need to know how to label green loans and how to quantify the environmental benefits and climate benefits of a green project. And they need to know how to conduct environmental risk analysis in the form of scenario analysis and stress testing. So all these require a lot of resources on capacity building, knowledge exchange. And in that area, I think collaboration between developing countries and OECD countries are very important. Where OECD countries have a lot of resources and capacities, they need to really use some of the international initiatives to transfer such knowledge and best practices to emerging markets. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Majun. I've been feverishly taking notes. I think it's fantastic. The real kind of specific elements that you have highlighted to really green the financial system, from the importance of the taxonomy through the importance of mandatory disclosure and the importance of rethinking incentives to finally the critical role that capacity building in the financial sector has. And certainly, again, I think coming out collaboration is critical here. So thanks so much for your opening remarks here. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in our discussions. And thanks to everyone also for coming up with your thoughts and questions. I can see that the chat is getting very busy. So that's great to see. But with that now, let me turn to perspectives from the multilateral finance, from private finance and corporate sectors on how to scale climate smart investments. First, by addressing gaps in policy. We've heard about policy already quite a bit in the opening session, and also about rectifying existing policies. But second, also about how to better utilize concessional funds. And again, that has already also emerged from the conversation up to now. And third, by building capacity again to address risks and mobilize private capital to shift and remain on path towards net zero. So it's a real pleasure to invite Gemma Sacristan, who is the Chief Investment Officer at IDB Invest, to start giving your opening remarks. And Gemma, as the private sector arm of the IDB group, what do you see really of some of the new needs of the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean facing the COVID crisis? And how are you and how is IDB Invest managing to address them, while also thinking about how you can boost opportunities to advance the climate change agenda? Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much, and to the audience for joining today in such a relevant conversation for the recovery of our countries. We are seeing how the health and economic impact generated by this pandemic have changed attention toward the need of building social and resilience in the form of a stronger health system, wider safety nets, and a great access to education and connectivity, to say some things. As we move into the fourth month of this pandemic, we are certain that that economic stimulus for the recovery will be unprecedented, and the portions of that recovery needs are going to be huge, as has been already mentioned. Government to obtain such resources, especially in developing countries, but to pay attention to socioeconomic impacts and to address the issue that they need to increase this climate change approach recovery. Let us not forget that we are still a global commitment to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda, which incorporates fighting climate change as a key factor for sustainable development. At first sight, addressing the consequences of this crisis might feel disconnected from this agenda, but really it's not, as has been already mentioned. For example, we know now that there are clear links between the depletion of our ecosystem and a higher vulnerability of our health, with some studies pointed at correlations between high air pollution and more of COVID-19, and how land use and climate change can increase the probability of disease transfer from wildfire hosts and livestock. The lockdowns have demonstrated the positive, which is really bad. So far, we have seen the largest decline of carbon emissions on roads, and energy analysts are forecasting energy-related CO2 emissions will fall by 4%, which is more than 4 times as much as they fell in previous financial crises. This means a better environment for us, and but in a step of repeating previous crisis, we up opportunity for us, for all of us, by accelerating the transition to energy sources, can also be an important source of new. The IDB group, of which IDB Invest is part of, sees national determined contributions, the NDCs, as a tool to harness this opportunity to build a post-pandemic future based on climate change resilience, clean energy, as well as social and economic sustainability. For us in Latin America and the Caribbean, the social and economic sustainability are more than ever linked. The support of the IDB group to fight climate change is based on each country NDCs. We have mapped the challenges to implement them, and we have deployed several actions to overcome them, such as launching NDC Invest, a platform to help transform the NDC into investment plans and bankable pipelines. This is really relevant for us. Supporting countries to develop decarbonization pathways as the basis for their long-term strategies. Supporting efforts to connect NDCs with private sector actors through attracting interest in PPPs and crowding in private sector finance flows. At IDB Invest specifically, we have served as a bridge to increase access to climate financing in the private sector. We have been working under an approach that we call investing in reversing, founded on 3 pillars. The first one, promoting a sustainable finance sector. The second, attracting resources to sustainable projects. And the third, investing to facilitate climate change resilience. Since 2016, IDB Invest made the commitment to have 30% of its entire portfolio invested in climate change related projects by 2020. Last year, accounting for our own resources and mobilization, we surpassed that mark. As of today, climate financing represents 24% of our short and long-term portfolio, while only long-term portfolio is already up to 49%. So we are well on track to surpass that 30% we committed back in 2016. For 2021, as we pledged in the COP25 in Madrid last year, IDB Invest's new goal is to keep a minimum. It's no longer a target, it's going to be a minimum, 30% climate-related financing in our portfolio. But I would like to share a few examples of concrete ways to scale up this type of financing and the relevance for climate action agenda in the post-pandemic recovery. In December of 2019, during the COP25, we announced the launching of the world's first financial pilot to decarbonize power plants. This agreement was signed with ENGIE Energía Chile, a company that already had a plan in place to close coal-based plants following the government policy to decarbonize its energy matrix called Energy Road. Such pilot consisted in monetizing the reductions of emission by putting a value on the greenhouse gas emissions that are avoided as a result of the Commission's thermal coal power plants ahead of the schedule agreed with the government. Due to the decommissioning of the plants, there's a risk of having an increase of emission by the remaining plants. To avoid that risk, IDB Invest will support the financing of new renewable energy plants with similar power generations. That way, the pilot is set to encourage the closure of 2 of the coal-based plants that ENGIE has in Chile, which will reduce up to 1.2 million tons of CO2. There is also an initiative called Finance to Accelerate the Sustainable Transition Infrastructure, or FAST-Infra, that aims to scale up private investments in sustainable infrastructure in the developing world through the creation of a specific labeling process and tailored financing platforms. This is a very important project where IDB Invest has been invited to participate at the working group level, which surely my colleagues at this panel will send some thoughts to share. Another example to foster climate financing in the regions is the Green Bond Transparency Platforms. This is an initiative announced by IDB and IDB Invest last December with the goal of bringing greater transparency to the green bond market in Latin America and the Caribbean. The platform is currently in a beta stage with an official launch set for the fourth quarter of 2020. As you might know, green bond issuances has grown dramatically in Latin America in the last few years. Only in 2019, issuances were of 5.3 billion, bringing the accumulated total from 2014 to 2019 to 12.6 billion. And one of key challenges for the success of these instruments is to increase transparency. We really believe that transparency is going to be a key if we want to continue developing this market. Therefore, this platform will be a place where issuers, investors, and other market actors can upload and research information on transactions details, bond performance, use of proceeds, and environmental impacts of green bonds in the region. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Gemma. I think for first of all, I think also for kind of emphasizing that the social and the economic sustainability are more than ever linked, and then really sharing number of concrete actions on how to overcome some of the current challenges, both through the NDC Invest platform that we have, but I think very importantly also all the specific initiatives that you have to really accelerate the shift from the dirty, let's say, investments towards more greener investments. I think really working with local financial institutions, with private sector partners to close coal power plants and replace them by renewable plants, and really thinking about other ways of attracting investment, both for sustainable infrastructure, but also more broader for the green bonds market. So I think lots of food for thought, lots of good practices, and again, I hope we will get into some of the details also with other panelists in our discussion. But with that, let me now turn to Melissa McDonald, who is the head of responsible investment at HSBC. It's wonderful to have you, Melissa. So we'd love to hear from you a little bit of perspective now from the financial sector on how to scale climate investments. So over to you.
Thanks, Barbara, and hi, everyone. So I think the starting point is collaboration, and at HSBC we believe collaboration in this area is absolutely key. So there are a number of initiatives where we are actively participating in order to help unlock private sector capital and direct it towards financing the low carbon transition. And we've already had a mention of a fast infra, which HSBC is one of the founding partners alongside Climate Policy Initiative, the OECD, and the IFC. And so fast infra is finance to accelerate sustainable transition. And there it's public-private partnership, as I've said, and to try and unlock and scale up private sector capital. And we've done a lot of thinking in the project there to understand what the blockages are. And we believe that there are it's really necessary for us to understand the sustainability and resiliency of infrastructure assets across their life cycle. So what we have in plan there is two main things, so two key actions. The first is the development of the sustainable infrastructure label, and that's looking across a broad spectrum of infrastructure assets, from what we term as net zero, which is renewables, etc. We have grey, which is water, utilities, and then finally, nature-based solutions, which has already been said today, is a critical component of the fight against climate change. So we split ourselves into 3 working groups. The first is looking at the development of the label, along similar lines as the green bond principles, but more specific to the underlying project nature of the assets. The second is about developing a platform for targeted financial interventions. And it's really important, particularly for emerging markets, because I think it's already been said today, there's close to $7 trillion required to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's each year, 7 trillion each year. The vast majority of that financing is going to be required in emerging markets. And so, I like the term which has already been used today on self-interest around local financing, but I would take that, and I would actually say that it's in the self-interest for all investors to be looking at financing in developing economies as well. That's absolutely critical. So today there is very little has come from the private sector into sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets, and it has been predominantly the national development banks and multilateral development banks who have been involved there. So what we'd like to do is build upon their local knowledge and perhaps, if possible, to refinance their balance sheets using targeted financial interventions, special purpose vehicles, where we raise private sector capital from predominantly developed economies to help fire up their balance sheets and enable them to redeploy into more projects using their local knowledge that we in the international investment community don't necessarily have. A critical precursor to that are these project preparation funds. We need to build the knowledge around the sustainability criteria that the international investment community will require to encourage them to go into local emerging market infrastructure investments. And then finally, we think a range of sustainable infrastructure funds, which is wrapping perhaps these existing assets from NDBs into diversified products that can then be on-sold to pension funds and other international investors. Is a good way of offering a somewhat de-risk exposure. I'm talking about operating assets rather than construction phase into the international community. So we're going to be working over the next few months to try and pull all of this together and to really sort of create a deep and liquid sustainable infrastructure marketplace. So I'll stop there, Barbara, and hand back. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing more on really how now that really the private sector is coming in, financial sector is coming in and trying to really help get much stronger on the sustainable infrastructure side. I think really thinking about how can you build on all the work that has been done in different fora around labeling. Again, importance of labeling, we've heard that already today, but also building on all the experiences, the knowledge from local financial institutions, from project preparation facilities. So I think there's lots of experience, but there's a real need to bring all this together into a larger platform and to create a real deep and liquid sustainable infrastructure market. And so Fast Infra, again, also via CPI, certainly committed to helping make progress on that, and would love to connect with others to making sure that we can have an impact and attract private capital at scale into emerging economies. So thanks for sharing that, and looking forward to also continuing the discussions in our Q&A. But with that, let me last but certainly not least turn to Anthony Hopley, who is the Executive Director of the Mission Possible platform at the World Economic Forum, and would love to hear a corporate sector perspective on opportunities to support recovery whilst also enhancing climate action, and also hearing some of the World Economic Forum's lessons related to the role of the corporate sector, or some of the opportunities that you think the World Economic Forum has to take this discussion further, particularly again with the.
So Barbara, thank you. And thank you to the CPI for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a very great opportunity. I have some really good notes, which I might skip through and ask, I'm happy to circulate them afterwards so I can sort of go faster in the interest of time and skip over perhaps some of the detail. There's a number of points I just want to hit very quickly. That this is about a transition, and we have to, you know, as we've seen already in some of the sectors that are starting to transition, we have to create a virtuous flywheel of investable policy that drives scale, that drives cost reductions, that drives more policy, and so on. That has to become self-sustaining, you know, and draw in the finance, whether that's public or private. Jobs. I mean, I think we've heard a lot about stimulus and these social and sustainability benefits, but I think we have to, as a community, start to make the connection with jobs. I just, that is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, so I want to touch on that. Dr. Marjane picked up the issue of the green taxonomy. So from our perspective, focused on industry transition, how do we connect that with the transition, and particularly the roadmaps and milestones, so that green taxonomy is also evolving as we move down that transition pathway, and we're hitting sort of milestones that we need to be in 2025, in 2030, in 2035, and so on. And then I'm glad that Melissa picked up on support of collaboration. I mean, we don't get this virtuous flywheel, I think, without public, private, and civil society collaboration. And I think this is what the forum, the World Economic Forum, is really thinking about across all of our platforms and work at the moment. You know, as this crisis has swept across the world, you know, we've mobilized all of our platforms to generate these strong public-private action by business, industry, policymakers. Our COVID-19 action platform, for example, and we're the forum is sort of, in a sense, recoalescing around this idea of a great reset. And that'll be the big theme for the annual meeting, Davos, in January, physical, virtual, or hybrid of both, whatever, you know, whatever it will be, but it will be built around this idea of a great reset. And I think that's critically important. And the work we're all involved in is one of the most important pillars, I think, of that. And if, you know, if I can, to quote Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, we only get one shot at spending the stimulus right. And I think that's absolutely correct. And we actually, I think, as we all know, we only get one shot at averting a climate catastrophe. And so strong cooperation between the public and private sector on financing this recovery, you know, has to be at the heart of this, and creating the right policy environments. I think we've all learned, all of us have been involved in this over the last, you know, years, decades, that there has to be a lot of granular work on those policy frameworks. They have to be investable, and you only get that right, you know, to Marjane's point. I think the most efficient way to put those rules in place is with regulators, but we only get that right if those policy frameworks are developed in collaboration with those who understand how you deploy capital and how you manage the risks. Yeah, a huge part of any sort of investment in infrastructure that is driven and incentivized by policy is understanding the policy risk and the policy frameworks. I think that's critical. And just to throw out a few statistics on jobs, the Stiglitz, Hepburn, Stern paper was mentioned. But what always surprises me is when that paper is mentioned, you know, there's some very interesting factoids in that paper around job creation that we need to be drawing out, I think, much more than we are as a community. I think something like every $1 million of green stimulus, it gets you something like 7.5 jobs in the sort of renewable energy infrastructure space. It gets you nearly 8 jobs in the energy efficiency space, but it only gets you just over 2.5 jobs in the fossil fuel space. Just to draw on some examples from the Obama stimulus package in 08-09, you know, we know heavily high carbon, but there were some sort of diamonds in that package that are worth drawing on. The stimulus directed towards renewables in the US created an industry that now employs over 3 million people. 450 million bailout package to a then relatively little company employing less than 1,000 people called Tesla. That company now employs over 50,000 people and has completely disrupted the automotive sector. That I worked out that that cost the US taxpayer less than $10,000 per job. That was a pretty good return on that stimulus package. And the conditions put on the Detroit automotive companies in 2008 as part of their bailout to design and produce more fuel efficient cars meant that those companies were much more competitive in the international market. So I think this is an important point. So a lot of the work that Mission Possible is doing is building these business-led, high ambition groups of industrial players. So those who are prepared to make that leap, to take on a high ambitious target, whether that's net zero or to work towards a net zero target, and then to develop the roadmaps with milestones that they need to be working along, and starting to work on systems demonstration. So whether that's how do you measure carbon through the supply chain for steel or aluminium, how do you build green steel plants, and how do you finance those to start to get you to first base? How do you develop demand and start scaling up the production of sustainable aviation fuel in the aviation sector? What is the process and decisions over the next 10 years to get zero emissions vessels in the deep sea lanes on a commercial basis by 2030, and so on and so forth? Because if we can do this, if we can take these concrete steps of systems demonstration, we believe it makes it easier for governments then to act on the policy, because they can see that there is something against which their policy can get traction with. So this is an important part of the transition, and I think this collaboration between businesses and governments, I also put civil society in there as an important part of this package. At the forum, we've also created a group of CEOs, a CEO action group for the European Green Deal, who are very much working with European governments and the European Commission to feed in and to support, from a business perspective, the European Green Deal. So again, that's an important part, I think, of the collaboration and the move. And this group is chaired by the CEOs of AXA, Thomas Babel, and the honorary chairperson of Royal DSM, Feike de Spaesma, and has over 30 CEOs actively engaged in that community. And it's not all a one-way street. Those companies are very much looking at what can they do as companies, what concrete projects can they push forward as part of that transition and in support of the European Green Deal, and to what degree can they step up their commitments as a leadership group of businesses under the Green Deal approach. So in conclusion, I think achieving a green recovery and stimulating and scaling up, I think, the finance we need to fund NDCs cannot be done by policymakers and institutions alone, albeit they will create the most efficient way of putting the rules in place. But it requires strong collaboration between representatives from governments, industry, and the business sector. And I guess I pose a question, for us. We talk a lot about the stimulus package in 2008, 2009, and the global financial crisis. Maybe it is the green financial crisis. But what will people be saying 10 years from now about the stimulus package that we put in place? Will it be seen as a lost opportunity or as the defining moment putting the world on a net zero trajectory? And I think just to confirm that the World Economic Forum, and particularly the Mission Possible platform that I lead, is going to continue to work tirelessly to make sure that we seize this moment. We develop the roadmaps, we build the coalitions of business leadership, that we collaborate with governments and civil society to drive this agenda forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for sharing, I think, a lot of plans from the forum. I think I very much like the idea of this virtual flywheel that you mentioned, but also the need for this great reset. So I think, as you said, like thinking about how you can concretely connect the industry, the business sector, with policymakers, and really come up with concrete roadmaps and coalitions to ensure that there is no lost opportunity, and to ensure that in 10 years we will not say we have created zombie industries or other kind of basically industries that were supposed to basically merge out of our economies as part of an accelerated transition towards a low carbon future. So thanks so much for sharing that. And I am going now to go to our many questions and contributions that we've heard from the audience. And I thank you very much for all your contributions here. Again, I think we've heard a great set of ideas and action items from our speakers already. And let me now bring in a few of the questions, at least getting started a little bit. And I think I'd love to get started first with combining a few of the questions that we've seen from the audience coming in, and really thinking a little bit more about how interventionists combine regulation and the leveraging of global capital flow. So really, how can carbon tax mechanisms be better designed to not just incentivize low carbon activity, but also to bring in some additional funding, for example, in the context of forest protection. And we've had a few questions around this one. So let me just pause here and see whether any of our speakers would like to reflect a little bit on this intersection between really how to combine regulation and the leveraging of global capital flows. And any thoughts from anyone from the audience here?
Barbara?
Carlos, yes, please.
Thank you. So it was a great panel. Thanks everybody for all the different contributions. I think that we all add very positively from our very own sector and perspective. And that was great. I learned a lot about a couple of things. But let me concentrate a little bit about the carbon tax and other financial, fiscal instruments that we need to be able to think about. When I share the Costa Rican experience about the tropical carbon tax in other developing countries, I normally have a reaction in the lines of we are a poor developing country. We cannot tax fossil fuels. It will be very difficult. We are poor, whatever. And I try to let them understand that it's not the poorest segments of that society the one that should be paying for that carbon tax. And if you develop a payment for environmental services, you will be transferring money from the highest segment of that society's income segment from that society to the lower income segment of that society, creating a flow of resources from urban areas to rural areas. So here we need to connect many dots. And one, for me, key in this element is that we don't have any ongoing global financial mechanism that can fully compensate the offsetting services being provided by natural ecosystems. And here I'm not talking just forests, I'm talking about ocean, land, whatever, natural ecosystems. At this point, the pressure of converting natural ecosystems into something else, I won't call it even a productive landscape, is ongoing. And what we saw last year about forest fires just to magnify today, this year. And I think that we need to move fast because nature is our safety net, is our insurance to climate change. And we're losing it very quickly. And if we see the flow of resources that are being mobilized, I want to highlight this one more time, is being mobilized massively, but in the north, in climate mitigation, and particularly on the energy transportation sector. So we need to be able to understand that the ODA resources should help countries deal with the climate adaptation processes, but we need to be able to understand that those ODA, bilateral, multilateral, should be policy relevant. And this is one of the things that I've been working and thinking as I move from the government of Costa Rica to the GEF. When I do the analysis on the return of the GEF investment, I get many conclusions. And one kind of clear conclusion is that GEF can do way more in terms of having a high return in terms of policy outcomes in their investment. GEF does a lot of great things, and the GEF has done fabulous things for the last 25 years. But you know what? They haven't changed the world. And that is for two reasons. One, because GEF only mobilizes 6% of the global resources for nature conservation, climate change, and environmental investment. And secondly, because their set of expected outcomes is very much in the, how do I say, physical, geographical, natural outcomes. There's a gap or a need to really focus on projects that has the transformational possibility based on a clear understanding on policy development, policy enhancement, and dealing with the institutional failures. And I finish here by talking a little bit about the institutional failures, because GEF can do way better in what they do. Countries can mobilize more resources. The flow of resources from the north to the south can increase dramatically. We can green the banks and the capital markets, but there's a very important pending agenda, which is the fact that the institutional framework, when I talk about the institutional framework, I'm talking about how governments organize themselves in agencies. So you see me as the Minister of Environment of Costa Rica, but that's partially true. I'm also the Minister of Energy. I'm also the Minister of Mines, Water, and Oceans. I don't have a Minister of Energy and Mines to fight with. And that is very important, because Costa Rica has been able to develop an institutional framework that is responding to our sustainability aspirations. And this hasn't been done properly in most of the country. Europe is moving towards that direction as well. So when I talk with ministers of environment in my region in Latin America, I normally feel that they got an issue with the Minister of Energy and an issue with the Minister of Agriculture. And if you see where emissions are coming from, they're coming from those two sectors, from the energy sector and from the agricultural sector. And there are no dialogues. There is a lot of confrontation. And then on the other side, when I have my meetings with the ministers of energy from Latin America, they're talking oil and gas constantly, talking oil and gas. I'm the Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. I don't talk about oil and gas. But the rest of the country, which by the way are working on their NDCs and everything, the Minister of Energy and Mining is talking oil and gas and open pit mining in forested areas, in national parks, in indigenous territories for gold, silver, and minerals. So if we are not able to really change the institutional framework and generate the political dialogue on how we move from where we are towards the ideal institutional framework, and the ideal one for me is the one that doesn't make a difference within the management of renewable and non-renewable natural resources. There should be just one very strong agency that set the national policies at the landscape level, avoiding the silo effect or the sectoral vision. I conclude with this. We need to be able to understand that we can do great in mobilizing resources like never before. That won't be enough if we don't do the repair of the institutional failure that we have at the national levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I think thank you so much for pointing to this last point. I think really we need systemic solutions. We need to address these institutional failures. I think this is the only way to really create a answer and a strategy that can allow us to really put us onto a pathway for a better world. So thanks so much for sharing us, but also for sharing some of the innovative mechanisms that come back to this this intersection between how to combine regulation and the leveraging of global capital flows. And I'd love to actually follow up this, Majun, on this. Also, just from your work, what messages do you have for countries considering carbon taxes or other types of regulation? So would love to hear from you, and then actually would then like to have a similar question also to Anthony around the importance of corporations to carbon pricing. But let me first go to Majun.
I didn't mean to answer the question on carbon tax, but since you asked, I say just a few words. Carbon taxation is not currently practiced in China. We do have our carbon markets. We started with 7 regional carbon markets as a pilot program, and now moving towards a nationwide carbon market, which will be up and running starting from end of this year. In a few years' time, this national carbon market should be covering around 50% of the total carbon emission for the country. That's sort of answering your first question, but I'd like to really touch upon the global green capital flows. I would like to give you 2 examples of how we can facilitate global green capital flows for money really to move from capital-rich countries such as Europe to places where green assets are abundant, like China. In China, we have a huge amount of green loans on the balance sheets of the banks, currently at about 12 trillion RMB. And this is much larger than the outstanding amount of green bonds, I think around 1 trillion. So the problem is that with such a vast amount of green loans, even though external demand may be significant, like in Europe or UK, where interest rates are low, 0 or negative, but they cannot buy loans from China. That's why one innovation is to convert these green loans into ABS, asset-backed securities, so that they can be sold to the international markets through specific channels such as the Bond Connect program. And we need a lot of innovations in this areas by improving some regulations, but more innovation at the corporate level, and also more awareness of foreign investors such as those from Europe and the UK. The second example is green tech cooperation, meaning utilizing green environmental low carbon technologies that developed in other places, especially in Europe and UK, which you have adopted such technology to fix environmental problem for many decades. But China has a much bigger market because air pollution, water pollution, land contamination is a much more serious problem, and carbon emission is also a much more serious problem. So the potential market and potential revenue that can be generated from applicating these, utilizing this green technology is huge there. That's why something like a platform for utilizing foreign technology on green in emerging markets such as China, I think will be a very good way to channel green capital flows along with technology. In fact, China UK is now working in this direction. We have decided to incubate a green tech center in Beijing and also facilitate the launch of green tech fund in Beijing.
Thank you so much, Majun. I think really excellent addition, some really innovative ideas around how you can really leverage the global capital flows, both through the ABS, which I think really allows you also to attract kind of the larger pools of capital that are out there, but also this green tech cooperation, the green tech cooperation that you're exploring, I think certainly will have very, very important lessons. So let me move on, and Anthony just again, as I said before, reflect a little bit again on the importance of corporations to carbon pricing. How can more carbon pricing be supported in the run-up to COP and during the recovery, and what do you think is the role of corporations there? And I'll after that we'll go to Melissa also on thinking a little bit on how carbon pricing can be integrated into investment allocation, even if it's not required by the jurisdiction. But Anthony, first, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. I might also deal with what we can do when we don't get carbon pricing. I mean, as you know, I'm a carbon pricing person, spent nearly 15 years of my career trying to make carbon markets work. I helped design the registry system for the EU emissions trading scheme, wrote the original draft of the registry regulation for the European Commission way back, and helped design the UK's pilot scheme, and get many of the big banks into the first round of carbon markets and other players. So but perhaps I'm a little bit cynical as a result, because clearly if we could get a carbon price, it's the most efficient and effective mechanism at the scale we need. I mean, I don't think there's any argument about that. I'm probably more of a carbon markets person than a carbon tax person, but I'd settle for either at the moment if it's at the right level. So how do we, so to first attack your question and then come to what we can do, if we don't get that perfect carbon pricing world, because I think that's important. I think we need to do what we're doing now and others are doing, which is mobilizing business and business advocates for a carbon price. And I mean, that's a key part of what we're doing with our various communities within the World Economic Forum. It's not just a commitment to net zero, and it's not just a commitment to TCFD level disclosure. It's also a commitment to support carbon pricing and have an internal carbon price. But if companies are going to have an internal carbon price where there isn't a national one, that has to be a real internal carbon price, not just a shadow carbon price against which they stress test future investments, but they have to actually implement that. Real money has to flow around as a result, and I don't think many companies have gone to that stage. That's what we should be pushing for, and clearly, and I think this is something that's on the agenda of the active investors, the Climate Action 100 Plus, the Alliance of Asset Owners Alliance, that companies are, what they're lobbying and the trade associations they're part of are consistent with their public position on carbon pricing. That's clearly important, because the thing we run into is the barriers. I mean, the political barriers to an effective carbon price are much higher than we ever anticipated, and I'm not sure that's changed yet. We might be on the cusp of that changing, but I think that that's maybe a little bit pessimistic, and we should keep pushing for it, because a carbon price at the right level will make a huge, will be transformational. However, we need to be pushing forward at speed and not waiting for that. So what can we do until there's a carbon price? I think it is realizing that we don't, in terms of scaling, as we have learned from wind and solar, and we're now learning from batteries and electric vehicles, we don't need to win everywhere at once. We just need to win in some key places to begin with. So if you think of the energy transition, we had a first mover in Germany that put the sort of energy vendor in place and the support mechanisms that started the process of scaling that technology and bringing the costs down. You then had other governments come in, a handful of other governments, UK, Spain, and the US with its tax credit scheme, to sort of start incentivizing renewables and continue that scale, bring that price down. Then had a massive, stimulus in 08, 09 from the US, and then China scaling production. So if you think about it like that, I think in many of the sectors, and we also need to think about this in terms of sectors, not just countries, because a lot of what we do now is sectoral, not just defined by the borders of countries. How do you scale the how do you start that same process in scaling those technologies and getting that virtuous flywheel going in each of these sectors? I think you have to identify, the first domino and then the second domino in terms of countries. So which are the countries that are most predisposed to put the right policy package in place to start that flywheel going? And I think that's a critical part of this process. So I think that's how I would think about it, and that's what we can be doing whilst we're simultaneously pushing for that perfect world of a carbon price. I'd also just want to make one other point to the minister's point just now on natural climate. We also foresee a potential risk that as we drive towards decarbonisation and net zero, the finance that started to flow from the corporate sector into natural climate solutions gets choked off as companies go, well, I've made a net zero commitment now, I'm investing in decarbonising my own business. I no longer need to invest in, you know, high quality offsets and channel finance into natural climate solutions. That would be a huge mistake, because I think, as all of us know, it's not an either or, it's both. If we decarbonised industry but we didn't address the natural climate and avoid, you know, and reverse deforestation and start to extend the capacity of the natural climate to absorb emissions, we still fail. So we have to think of a narrative that joins up those two sides and makes it clear to everybody, including the climate civil society movement, that it is not an either or, it's both.
Great, I think I'm next. So if you're looking for a business advocate for carbon pricing, you know, you have one here. HSBC has been part of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition for some time, and you know, it's already been said on the call today that now would be a good time, carbon pricing so low, for it to be expanded more broadly. What we've done within our own business and portfolios is look at low carbon scenarios analysis, which uses not just carbon pricing, but ability to pass through new technologies and changes in consumer sentiment. And this is the second time we've published the report. It's in the public domain. You can find it on my website. And that looks at the impact on valuation of not just companies in the broad listed equity sector, but also on credit ratings, using an Altman Z-score to convert the company valuation to credit rating changes. And now what we're trying to do is actually figure out how to integrate that into our day-to-day investment decisions in our portfolios. It's not an easy exercise. It's tough, but it's something that, you know, we are throwing a lot of resources at and taking very seriously. I agree on the you know, the need for the carbon sinks and the role of finance and accounting in evaluating and financing nature and biodiversity. So I think over time, looking at not just carbon pricing, but valuation on biodiversity is something that's going to be really critical, and it's work that that we are looking at with some partners in the industry. I don't really have much more to add at this point on that though, so I'll hand back to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And apologies for having had a little glitch here with internet. Still happening after many months of working at home, but thanks so much for doing that. And I know that my colleagues have been stepping in, but I'd love to just make sure that we also hear from Gemma, again, particularly I think on the adaptation side, where IDB and IDB Invest have been really proactive in coming up with new ideas. So really understanding a little bit more how conditionality can be imposed to promote and more sustainable production consumption. So what are some of the innovative ways for adaptation finance?
Very important how to show the way we work and how we adapt to the way we invest in that regard. So very important for us to address the issues and the transactions we can finance in that regard. So in that part, we believe we can work in that. Second, and the third, and very important, all the things we do together to finance from one part to the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And I know we're getting slowly to the end of our time, but I would love just to end on a question, basically 2 points. Like one, a little the role of the development of NDCs, in all this kind of innovative thinking, and how can we really push a green recovery while enhancing climate action, and really thinking about what are the links between some of the suggestions that you all shared with us in this session, and really on what are ways of really coming up with new ways of scaling up climate investments, but really what are the links between the better recovery and raising the ambition of NDCs, coming back to the original topic of this session. So I'd love to see whether we could have some reflections on really this link between the NDCs and the better recovery. So let me maybe see, Anthony, whether you have any initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at many of the NDCs, there's obviously a variation, but I think the NDCs present a really, I think, exciting opportunity to create effectively a sort of a pipeline of investable opportunities, and that requires, I think, probably more granularity in those NDCs to really start, setting out what are the specific areas and projects and sectors within that country, and the associated investment-friendly policy packages that can be developed. And I think if we went to that next level in the development of NDCs and thought of them as creating an investable pipeline of projects, that would, I think, make it easier for the investment community to assess them and understand where they can invest. Also start to, we have to change our thinking. I mean, I think the way our whole economy, the way we've been taught, is to think in very short time lines, sometimes as short as, report your next 3 months, or, certainly longest 12 months reporting line, or, end of financial year. Whereas we've got to now think in a 30-year timeline. And we've got to move from what I would call snapshot thinking to transitions thinking. So developing the pipelines of investments, not just in the next year, but in the next 5 years and the next 10 years, and understanding how that roadmap is going to play out, and how we're going to sequence the innovation, how we're going to sequence the financing, how we're going to deal with, the people who are going to lose their jobs in one sector, and sort of, the just transition part of transition into the next piece. We've got to get really granular, and we need the industry transition, the net zero transition roadmaps are a critical part of that. And unfortunately, it's still pretty patchy out there with respect to those roadmaps. So we have to focus on that and provide the resources to develop those roadmaps, because they are a critical part of this. And if I may do a quick plug, on Tuesday, 7th of July, we have our Industry Transitions Day, and this will be one of the topics. If you really want to dig into this in more detail, that's your opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anthony. And I think really kind of, emphasizing the importance of planning and the roadmaps, and really making that in a synergetic way between NDCs and the green recovery certainly is key. So with this, let me actually just make a very, very quick final round, like a 1-minute statement from each of my panelists. And unfortunately, Minister Rodriguez had to leave, but like a very quick, just like your, if there was like, if it were Christmas now and you had like one wish, what do you think is the most important ingredient or the most important action for a green recovery, which in turn can help countries to be more ambitious in their long-term strategies to address climate change? And so I'd love just to get a final word from you on that one. And let me get started with Majun.
Thank you. I think just to answer your question on how to raise ambition, I think we need to fully utilize many of the international platforms, which have all the senior policymakers from many countries to express their intention and policy priorities going forward. Not every country has really seriously thought about green recovery, green stimulus yet. But if we give them opportunity to speak on that topic, that's going to give them some pressure. It's a peer pressure. So I would say that those countries that are hosting G20, hosting COP21, hosting the COP15 biodiversity conference, and those who are chairing the central bank network for green finance, and those who are chairing international platforms for sustainable finance, prepare the agenda with the key topic as green recovery and green stimulus. I think it's going to invite a lot of positive contribution and positive competition for more ambitious target.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marjun, for sharing this thought with us. Let me hand over to Gemma.
I would like to finish just stressing the importance that the collaborations between the public and the private sector are going to have in the sustainable recovery of every country in the world. The usual argument is that financing for the public sector will not be enough, and we need the private sector to get in. But this is still true, and we believe in that. But we have evidence that shows that incentivize these collaborations also bring macroeconomic benefit. And I'm referring to a study that was published in June by the University of Oxford, groundbreaking revelation that is that there's a significant correlation between average ESG score of companies and their native macroeconomic country macroeconomic performance. So this is very important because it shows that there's a high ESG performance aligning with an improvement in GDP per capita and a reduction on unemployment. So for us, this is really, really important because so far we are used to see the promotion of ESG practices in the private sector as a good business case, and we fully agree with that. But now we can also say that such practice can bring or can be an important way for policymakers to accelerate economic growth and development. And this is relevant, very relevant for us. Now, the governments, as we know, they are deciding pathways for the recovery funds and are getting ready to deploy, as everyone has said in this event, unprecedented amounts of money to really recover from the crisis. So we really believe that more than ever, as I said, the public and private collaborations are going to be really important. And in that way, the green recovery is a key to unlock economic benefits for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gemma, and thank you so much for stressing this important point again. And Melissa, can I hand over to you?
Yes, sure. So I'm sorry, I don't have one, I have 7, but these are if they're policy asks. So the first would be to unleash massive investment in the renewable power systems. The second would be to boost construction sector via green buildings and green infrastructure. The third is support of the automotive system whilst pursuing clean air. Number 4 was make further government support to business conditional on climate commitments. Number 5 was targeted support for innovative low carbon activities. Number 6 was accelerate the transition of the fossil fuels industry. And finally was the strong carbon price. And so, just in conclusion, we'd like to see strong, not let this crisis opportunity go to waste, and to see strong policy positions, not only in the financial sector, but in the real economy sector as well. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And it's good to be ambitious also in our wish list. So I like your elements. Anthony, over to you.
Thank you. Well, everything Melissa said, but no, if I have to specify, when I wake up on Christmas morning, 25th December 2020, under the Christmas tree with a lovely bow tied around it, would be a whole packet, with the resources so that we can actually deliver globally, with all the necessary regional variations that will be there, a series of net zero roadmaps, actionable, granular net zero roadmaps, and commitments from governments that they will benchmark their green stimulus and their bailouts against delivery of those roadmaps with milestones in 2025, 2030, etc. And we will be discussing this. We have a whole session on green stimulus where I think I'm going to bring up a lot of these questions now that you've helped me with on Tuesday. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much,
So
Anthony.
I've got Siri trying to barge in.
Thank you so much. So with those excellent final remarks, let me again try and do justice to the rich discussion today. I think we clearly heard that we have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, for a more resilient, and a more sustainable future. And we should seize the opportunity to be ambitious in planning and in enacting policy that targets both the short-term economic recovery and the long-term structural changes that can help achieve the dual goal of having economies recover while also enhancing the ambition embodied in NDCs. I think, in fact, both NDCs and the Green Resilient Recovery packages are whole of government planning exercises. We heard a lot about planning, and they are key to successful green recovery. Because in the end, a successful green recovery really needs to have the investor confidence in sustained government policy to support the green transition. So countries, I think we've heard a few examples, particularly from Costa Rica, countries that explicitly link the short-term green recovery planning with the longer-term NDC and long-term strategy planning. They are sending a very strong investor signal that green is being woven into the fabric of a country's economic development and growth plans rather than a flash in the pan. So the discussions that they have also confirmed, again, I think that it will be important to overcome siloed thinking, to propose public policy that is climate smart and investor friendly, one that really helps address risks effectively to attract investment, especially in developing and emerging countries where financing needs are greatest, and particularly when public and concessional finance are efficiently used to harness and co-opt private capital to deliver an inclusive, sustainable future. So we need international cooperation. We've heard a lot about bridging between the different platforms. We need to engage more donors. We've heard that very clearly also from our opening session. And we need innovation in policies, in institutions, as Carlos said, in financial mechanisms. So it's indeed very clear from the rich discussion today that the huge flows of recovery finance expected over the coming months make it especially important to maintain focus on the enabling and catalytic role of public finance. So I was particularly heartened to hear both Minister Schulze and Minister Korten in our opening session highlight their commitment in this area, including the joint development of a new NAMA facility funding window to enable increased NDC ambition in the wake of COVID-19. Again, as Carlos said, where is the money? Hopefully there is additional money that will be flowing to these areas, and also think that the COP26 finance campaign work in this area will be critical to maintain momentum, and we certainly look forward to hearing more about the presidency's plans ahead of the autumn's key events, which are including UNGAR, the Development Group annual meetings, the London Climate Action Week November sessions, and the Financing Common events in Paris. So we will continue to support this pathway, including through another convening in November. And we hope that these dialogues and all the expertise we get from our speakers and from our audience really feeds into the COP26 finance campaign. So we very much look forward to doing this together with you. And so I would like to thank you all on behalf of the UK, Germany, and CPI as co-organizers for participating and engaging on this critical issue. And a big thanks to all our esteemed speakers and also to all our teams for making this happen. So please stay safe and stay well, and see you soon, and goodbye, and auf Wiedersehen.